Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to this podcast which is titled Cultural Studies and Its Futures. And this title has been chosen not only for its, I hope, topicality, but also its personal inflection this week. We've got an announcement to make, and our friends and our colleagues around the world who follow us on alternative social media sources already know this, but for our great podcast listeners around the world, we'd like to share a bit of personal information with you. We have left Charles Sturt University, and we have much pleasure in announcing that our future is in Adelaide in South Australia, and one of the great universities in the world, Flinders University. It's known best for its interdisciplinarity and its international inflection. It really is a remarkable place, like Simon Fraser in Canada, like Keele in the United Kingdom. So we're thrilled to be going there. So yay us. But the other bit of information we wanted to give you that is linked with the topic of the podcast this week is cultural studies, because I'm going as the Dean of Graduate Research, which I'm thrilled about. But I had to pick a professorship, as did Steve Redhead, my beloved husband and partner through life. And we had to choose a title for our professorship, and we did talk about it as a family in the household. And we made a decision, the pair of us, to render our professorships Professor of Cultural Studies. Now, that may seem retrospective for some people, it might seem backward, it might seem an odd choice. Why didn't we choose city imaging or creative industries or media or something a bit wow? Why did we go cultural studies? So part of our discussion today about the paradigm that is cultural studies might provide an introduction and an indication to why we chose those titles. But Steve, congratulations, darling one.
Thank you.
And let's get into what is quite a serious conversation that we hope will be part of in terms of a leadership role in Australia and beyond, to think about cultural studies through the 2010s and the 2020s, because we're sort of reaching that point now as well. So, Steve, we really do need to start, I think, with the key question, and that is what the hell actually happened to cultural studies? It seemed to me, as someone who was teaching it at Murdoch University at the time, it lost its way in the early 2000s. Something happened between about 2002 and 2005, and it seemed to lose its direction. Now, do you think this was linked with a wider decline in the humanities?
I do think there's a big change in cultural studies in this last 10 or 15 years, yes. I mean, it's quite interesting that founding fathers of cultural studies like Graham Turner in Australia and Lawrence Grossberg in the United States about 4 years ago published books which were on the future of cultural studies question mark. So What's Become of Cultural Studies by Graham Turner.
A great book too.
Absolutely, really watershed book in terms of the questions it was asking. And the same, I think, goes for Lawrence Grossberg's Cultural Studies in the Future Tense. And also, I mean, those were international calls, really, for what is the future of cultural studies. But also you had the death of Stuart Hall a couple of years later, a couple of years ago now. And his influence, particularly from Britain, I think made a difference, and the questions over his legacy raised questions about cultural studies. But I think you're right about the time scale. I think what happened, I think it's true of all disciplines, actually. I mean, my argument would become post-disciplinary. Yeah. I think all disciplines took a long look at themselves after the global financial crisis. So, sociology, and particularly cosmopolitan sociology, if you can call it that, I think failed to explain or to predict the global financial crisis. And it threw it into, through the discipline, into a real crisis. The same with economics. And I think you could go on. Cultural studies has also had to raise itself up and ask the question, what is the future of cultural studies, partly as a result of that. It's also partly as a result of other kind of watershed global political shifts. And I think you're right, from 9/11 onwards, really, there's been a problem. But I think it's interesting that, as you say, we've chosen our professorships as cultural studies, and I did the same when I was an adjunct professor, or started as an adjunct professor at York University in Canada from 2013. I did the same. Somebody like Slavoj Žižek, for example, is still a professor of cultural studies at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. So even though you wouldn't necessarily associate him with cultural studies, that's what he chose to affiliate. And I think there is something going on in the whole shift that we're talking about in terms of what is the future of cultural studies. It's partly a matter of looking at what the past was.
Yes, absolutely. I think when we made that decision, it was an overt political decision. We won't
Very
lie to
much so.
podcast listeners. It was, this is a line in the sand. We are standing for something.
Yeah.
And that something is interdisciplinarity. It's internationalism in its best form. It's thinking about the political economy.
Yes.
It's thinking about culture in an overt, politicised way, and perhaps not defaulting back to the easy answers to difficult questions, whether it be class, race, gender, understanding through work like Guy Standing's Precariat, I think, and all sorts of new ways of thinking about post-Fordist bespoke identity and the profound effect of hyper bloody crazy consumerism is having on how we think about the self. Having said that, do you notice that research assessment frameworks in the last 10, 15 years have calcified to disciplines at the very point that disciplines are not providing social and political explanations?
They have. That's right. And that's why I think post-disciplinarity is important, that you've got this incredible conservatism around disciplines at the very point that they are in crisis.
And we're actually working against institutionalised systems, which is quite profound, I think. And talking about institutionalised systems, and this particularly is for our colleagues in North America and Canada and the United States. We have a lot of listeners in the States, and we are always welcome, and we love hearing from you. But I think particularly cultural studies has been blurred or enmeshed with communication and media studies. A lot of the professorial titles I've had through my career, differently from you because of the law criminology thing with you, Steve, but most of my titles have been Professor of Communication, Professor of Media Studies, Professor of Communication and Media Studies, Creative Media, for example, at Bolton. This is really the first time I've been a clean chair professor in cultural studies. So have the so the communication with the communication systems, Carey, Innes, of course, for example, in North America, and the focus on media, particularly in the UK and Europe, has that taken something away from cultural studies?
Yes, I think there's no doubt that that has happened. The origins of cultural studies, if you like, in the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham in the mid-1960s, marked it out as something different. But actually, what happened to cultural studies, one of the trajectories, was that it got enmeshed with something else, media studies, communication studies, which in some ways had a longer tradition and a more conservative tradition with a small c, I would argue. Somewhere along the line, the whole thing got mixed up. It got the original intentions, and particularly, as you said before, cultural studies' relationship to political economy and to the politics of culture, somehow got lost. I think you can trace it, and the two books we mentioned before do try to do that. But actually, if you don't get hold of that, it doesn't have a future. It will just get lost in communication studies, media studies, and so on.
Because what actually happened, I think, as someone who has taught in these areas, has actually taught in comm in North America, taught in media in the United Kingdom, is the study, the teaching, the learning, the research has been reified down to the platform. So we teach communication systems, and we teach media, social media, television, the internet. And actually the whole point of cultural studies was not to teach the platform, not to teach the object, but to teach the subject, to teach it in a political, to make a stand and work out exactly what the key questions were before we could answer them. But we were never ever studying the object, the platform.
I agree. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, well, it's only just me as I sort of realised I was suddenly the Professor of Media, and all of a sudden all the politics seemed to drift away, and we were teaching, best use of Twitter, how to use Facebook well. And you're going, right, that probably wasn't the point. Also, I wanted to go back. You've already talked about the longer history and heritage of these disciplines, Steve. Well, probably cultural studies, going right back to Hogarth, really, was a relationship. Cultural studies at its most basic, if we look at its parents, then they were probably English and sociology, I would say. You think about Birmingham, you think about Warwick, it's English, it's sociology. But what do you think is cultural studies' relationships with those parental disciplines now, and also the really edgy interdisciplinary paradigms that are emerging in and around leisure studies at the moment?
I think you're right. English and sociology were key factors in the development of, say, the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham.
Text and context.
Absolutely. And Richard Hoggart, who was the first director of it in 1964, so it's over 50 years now, was from an English background. There certainly were other disciplines, but I think one of the interesting things is that actually PE was one of them.
Yes.
So someone like Tony Jefferson, for example, came out, and others, in fact, came out of the physical education background, and that was true of the CCCS. And it was always one of my interests in the first place, that link between leisure and cultural studies. And you've got people like John Clark and Chas Critcher. Chas Critcher was part of that. He was a referee, for example. Yeah. I think you've got that.
And that's not for journals, guys.
No, that's right. He was both. He was football referee.
Both. That's fantastic.
But actually, the two things together, leisure and cultural studies, which form the subject of a great book like The Devil Makes Work, for example, by Clark and Critcher in the mid-'80s. That was an example of how the link came about. And in some ways that's been erased. That link has been erased. It's a very, very important link in my view, partly because my own work has been in that field for, perhaps the last 20 or 30 years. But actually it is an important one. It's one that's been lost, and I think you're right about English and sociology, but I think that leisure studies area too is an important link, and cultural studies needs to renew itself around that.
And there's plenty of new paradigms to enable that. Obviously, we've talked a lot about deviant leisure cultures, digital leisure cultures, but also food studies, which is big, very big, wine studies and so forth. But where I'm politically also interested in leisure studies is it forces us to think in a concrete, powerful, passionate, political fashion about the nature of work.
Yes.
A lot of the material I'm reading at the moment, and colleagues on Goodreads might like to find a lot of this work that I'm reading at the moment, is really trying to think about what the hell has happened to work in the last 25 years. And part of that's caused by the relationship between production, consumption and digitisation.
Yep.
But I think shining a big light on leisure will help us create space outside of work.
Very much so. And that question, which was originally a leisure studies question 30 years ago, what is the leisure society and when will it come? The fact is that the issues were all about work, political economy and so on, but actually the issue about when the leisure society will come was always at the forefront.
Very powerful. Now, we've also committed quite deeply in the last, you could say sort of 4 years, but particularly in the last 3 in our work with Dr. Leanne McRae, and big love to Leanne, we've committed to physical cultural studies.
Yes.
We're just about finished a book on it. We're getting a series of articles out in this field. So, physical cultural studies, is this a useful field? What is its relationship to cultural studies, and can it lead the way for cultural studies to renewal?
I think definitely physical cultural studies has got to be taken seriously. I think the way that it came probably in these last 4 or 5 years, with international scholars really congregating around this new label, I think what happened was that sociology of sport, leisure studies, cultural studies of leisure, did get sidelined by this new label, physical cultural studies, quite rightly, because I think the other areas had got exhausted, and they weren't always in the sociological field anyway. The fact that something is now called physical cultural studies, there are handbooks on it that we're writing about and many other international scholars are writing about it, is actually a major signpost, I think. There's the theory of the body and body culture, movement cultures around that, but also it is actually the bringing back of cultural studies. So physical cultural studies is twofold. It's about physical culture, but it's also the cultural study of movement and the body.
And of course, I use movement metaphorically, theoretically, and as a trope. So it's not simply moving the body; it's about social, political movement. What was the line from Paul McCartney? The movement you need is on your shoulder.
Yes, and that ties in nicely with, say, the work of John Urry and other colleagues at Lancaster and their sociology of mobility,
That was
mobility studies, which really again has gone under the radar, but is an important part of this. And it fits with the developments around physical cultural studies. There's no doubt about that. And people who used to work in those sorts of areas, Mike Featherstone and so on, they're coming back, if you like, around the cultural study of the body and physical cultures.
Oh, it's tremendous. We're also living in, and I'll pinch your phrase because I'm allowed to do that because I cook for you, we're living in theoretical times, and I've been loving this. You and I made a decision when we returned from England that we would no longer apologise for being theorists, because so often through our career, and I'm sure for colleagues out there listening to this podcast, you know, people say, oh, look, that's only theory, or you're only a theorist. And you're sort of thinking, well, I'm reading the most difficult, complicated work being produced on this planet, and I've got someone who perhaps can't functionally manage the contents page saying you're only a theoretician. So we are living in theoretical times. So this is exciting. I am loving the work I'm reading at the moment. It's rich, it's powerful, it's bloody difficult, it's dense, it's wonderful. But what's amazing is this high theory has been disconnected from cultural studies. And always I love cultural studies because it was difficult. You were reading some cutting edge theory. That's now gone. So how is this disconnection between these great high theorists and cultural studies, how has the disconnection happened?
I think it's just the exhaustion of disciplines. And in some ways, this, you know, they have a shelf life, and I think that's to some extent what happened in cultural studies. You're absolutely right. What I call theoretical times is worth taking seriously. The theorists and the way that they've become part of this hyper-real culture, celebrity intellectual culture, you know, which social media has a lot to answer for. Zizek's a great example. Alain Badiou, Baudrillard before he died,
Bowman,
Zygmunt Bauman, and so on. You know, we are in theoretical times, but of course, it's partly ironic that I'm calling it that because, you know, there are a great deal of untheoretical times. Empiricism and reaction is all around us, so, you know, it is slightly a joke. But I do think there's no doubt that what I'm writing about in theoretical times is actually happening. There's no question of that. But I think you're absolutely right about the theory, so that one of the things that's so obvious about cultural studies over the last 20 years or so, I think it is flagged up by Graham Turner and Lawrence Grossberg in their sort of watershed books of 4 or 5 years ago, is the fact that there has been a theoretical exhaustion. So the original political economy and sociology of, say, the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the early and mid-1970s, just to take that as an example, with Hall driving it, and many other theorists.
And of course, Gramsci and hegemony being the trope.
Absolutely. Gramsci and Althusser were the major focus of those people. And then others, but I mean, you know, they were theoretical times, there's no doubt about that. But actually what happened is that cultural studies actually internationally failed to take into account what was happening in what I would call the new materialism, in critical theory, in philosophy and contemporary studies around the world. The work of people like Badiou, Zizek and their acolytes, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. Yeah. There is no doubt that this has come into fruition over the last 5 or 10 years. It has also met with the post-global financial crisis politics too. So there's something happening there which is not happening in cultural studies. So my argument would be that the new materialism in critical theory, in contemporary philosophy, in psychoanalysis and so on, which is there's fantastic work going on, really, really good cutting-edge work going on. That needs to be transplanted back into cultural studies.
Because my fear is it almost became like a Catholic prayer, that we were looking at Gramsci, we were looking at Althusser, and it can say a reified version of Althusser too, I'd say, pre the tea towel, pre the killing of the wife. So, but it was Foucault, it was Althusser, and it was Gramsci. And those three were useful but did not provide answers to the really complicated issues, I would argue, as the 70s concluded. So if you think about it, I always use Poulantzas as an example. I think Poulantzas' rendering of hegemony was much more complex and useful than Gramsci. I'm the only person on the planet that believes that.
No, I agree with you.
But Poulantzas was like nobody.
Yeah.
He was like nobody. He wasn't even in the Last Supper. He wasn't even in the party because it was all about Gramsci. Now, Gramsci, respect, fantastic, but very, very straightforward, very, very basic. And the question is, when the theory no longer worked, or the theoretician, there was an inability to go to the next one and mine that seam with clarity.
I think so, and I think actually wrong directions were taken.
Yes.
You mentioned Michel Foucault, who became an industry in himself.
Indeed.
But my view in this case is that Foucault became an industry and actually a leader, and his work became a leader even after he died in 1984, even to the present day, in a neoliberal times. And actually Foucault gives succour to neoliberalism through his anti-statism. The recent couple of books that have come out in 2015 and 16, which actually lay bare this. I mean, it's heresy to say that, but I really think that's true. And the real problem then becomes, which direction do you take? Which theoretical direction do you take? And the point about the new materialism, I think, is that is clear, that there is incredibly erudite, high theoretical work going on, which now resituates these theorists in the right context. We're only, in a way, starting with that. But we actually almost threw the baby out with the bathwater in the 70s and 80s. We've got to get back to that to some extent.
We do, and my last question is returning us to what I think should have remained the concrete issue for the last 20 years, and because of creative industries. And by the way,
Yes.
I've intentionally not gone there in this podcast because I'm going to do a completely separate podcast on cultural studies in the creative industries, particularly in the dog's breakfast that is Australia. And I'll just park that comment at that point.
Absolutely.
Let's just park that at the moment. I think creative industries is implicated in this.
Yep.
But one of the areas in which they're implicated, I think, particularly the reified Australian version of it, is we've lost the complicated, brilliant discussion of popular culture and popular cultural studies, which was always this fabulous, sexy, interesting arm of cultural studies. So I would argue popular culture in and of itself has never been so strong and so interesting. You often call this high popular culture.
Yep.
I call it thinking pop. It's the stuff that actually gets its teeth into the culture and has a good bloody pull and draws some blood. It helps us think about what is going on in society and culture. So I'm thinking Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, the new X-Files that's just come out, Doctor Who Series 9, which I would die on a cross. I think Series 9 is the best series of Doctor Who that has ever been released, and I don't think that is even questionable. So popular culture is interesting. Music is really interesting at the moment. And the series of online triangulations are really provocatively interesting at the moment. Yet the theory to understand this amazing popular culture is dire. It's the only word I can use, is dire. I've been reading a lot of fan studies in the last month or so as I'm preparing for the next job, and it's just diabolical. The fan studies paradigm leaves me unwell, feeling physically sick. And I go back to some of the fan study stuff from the early 90s, and it's glistening, it's shining, it's interesting, it's provocative, and yet you bring it 20, 30 years forward, and this dreadful, dire, anti-theoretical, anti-political, why do we care stuff is being published. So, Steve, what's going on? Why is there a disconnection between really great popular culture and really crappy ways of understanding it?
I agree with you, and I certainly agree with you about popular culture. And it seems like Better Call Saul, which we're binge watching this afternoon.
Yes.
But I do think, again, you have to go back to the past to create the future, or the futures of cultural studies. So in the early 90s, I invented the term popular cultural studies, which was partly done with Derek Wynne, who was my co-director of the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture, to try and basically create a book series which Ashgate
you,
labelled Popular Cultural Studies, and also Blackwell, who published 2 great books. There were 16 books in the Popular Cultural Studies series by Ashgate. And the reason for doing it was partly tongue-in-cheek. It was actually really trying to get back to a popular cultural studies which had lost its way, I think.
That's it.
Funnily enough, in the early 90s.
Yep.
It's lost its way again. But so to make cultural studies popular, but actually to create a cultural study of popular culture, which is what I was interested in. So it was twofold, slightly ironic, and I think all these things have a shelf life. You know, the popular culture of Manchester, for example, of the early and mid-90s, soon became Gunchester, soon had a much more hard criminological edge to it. But still, you know, you have to deal with these things as they arise. But I do think the idea of it should be taken seriously. Popular cultural studies should be coming back, because there's the idea of making the study itself popular, to actually globalise it. And I think the thing about Theoretical Times is that, as you say, high theory, complex work about popular culture is back. There is no doubt about that. There's plenty of scope for it, even though we may be only starting on this new road. Actually, there's a huge amount of work, as you say, fantastic work for us to get our teeth into. But also, I think you've got to get this idea of the cultural study of popular culture back.
Yeah. And I think the Theoretical Times will enable that. But I think what we've picked up in the podcast today is there are these pockets of fantastic work happening in the high humanities that has nothing to do with cultural studies.
Yes.
Even Zizek's title, forgetting about that for a
Yep.
moment. So we've got this fantastic high theory, great complex understandings of the political economy post-GFC, some really interesting provocative work on identity politics, bodies and movement, and some really guns blazing popular culture that we can play in and off those former paradigms. So it's all there, none of which has been happening in cultural studies departments. So the role for us now, I hope, as we move to Flinders, and I hope a lot of our colleagues, I hope if there's anybody out there listening thinking of doing a PhD in cultural studies,
come and talk to us.
Come and talk to us. This is going to be big, and we've staked our claim on the importance of the future of cultural studies. We believe in this paradigm, and I think the time is now to reboot this and think about what popular cultural studies looks like. So, Steve, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.